The snow fell that December night in 1904 like a burial shroud over Juneau, each flake carrying with it the weight of secrets that would haunt this mining town for decades to come. I can still feel the bitter cold seeping through the wooden walls of our cabin, the kind of cold that freezes not just your bones, but your very soul. And as I write these words now, an old man with trembling hands, I know that some truths are too terrible to take to the grave. The wind howled through the spruce trees like the wails of lost spirits, and somewhere in that darkness, Margaret Holloway was taking her last steps as a married woman in Juneau. What happened that night would shatter more than just one family. It would crack the very foundation of trust that held our small community together against the merciless Alaskan wilderness. The lantern light flickered in my window as I watched her figure disappear into the swirling white, and I swear on my mother's grave, I should have followed her into that storm. But I didn't, and that single moment of hesitation would echo through the next 40 years of my life like a gunshot in an empty canyon. If you stay with me through this tale of betrayal and buried truth, you'll understand why some secrets are worth more than gold, and why the coldest places on earth sometimes hide the warmest hearts. Margaret had been Thomas Holloway's wife for 3 years when the winter of 1904 began to show its teeth, and in those 3 years, I'd watched the light in her eyes dim like a candle slowly running out of wick. She was a delicate thing, with hair the color of autumn leaves and a smile that could melt the ice off the Mendenhall Glacier. But Thomas treated her like just another piece of mining equipment, useful when needed, ignored when not. I lived in the cabin next to theirs, close enough to hear the arguments that raged through the thin walls, close enough to see the bruises she tried to hide beneath her woolen shawls. The sound of her crying on those long winter nights cut through me deeper than any pickaxe ever could, and I found myself lying awake, fists clenched, wanting to do something, but knowing that a man's business with his wife was considered sacred, even in a God-forsaken place like Juneau. Thomas worked the Lucky Strike claim up on Mount Juneau, spending weeks at a time in the tunnels, leaving Margaret alone with nothing but the wind and the wolves for company. But that December something had changed in her. There was a determination in her step, a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen since the day she'd first arrived from Seattle with such hope in her heart. The morning before she vanished, I found her chopping firewood behind their cabin, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air as she worked with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. Her hands were raw and bleeding from the cold, but she didn't stop when I approached, just kept bringing that axe down like she was trying to split more than just pine logs. "Morning, Margaret," I called out, my voice muffled by the thick scarf wrapped around my face, but she barely acknowledged me, just nodded and continued her relentless chopping. There was something in her posture that day, a tension coiled tight like a spring ready to snap, and when she finally looked up at me, her green eyes held a wildness I'd never seen before. "Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if something happens to me, promise me you'll remember that not everything in this town is what it seems." I should have pressed her for more, should have demanded to know what she meant, but the wind picked up just then, howling through the valley like a banshee, and by the time it died down, she had already turned back to her wood. That night, as the snow began to fall in earnest, I saw her pacing back and forth in front of her window, a shadow moving restlessly behind the yellow glow of lamplight, and I knew in my bones that something terrible was about to unfold. Thomas returned from the mine that evening with ice crusted in his beard and murder in his eyes, and even from my cabin, I could hear him bellowing at Margaret about something, though the wind made it impossible to make out the words. The argument lasted for hours, their voices rising and falling like a violent storm, punctuated by the sound of furniture being overturned and glass breaking against the walls. I pressed my ear to the thin wooden wall that separated our homes, my heart pounding as I tried to decipher what was happening, but all I could make out were fragments, something about money, something about Seattle, something about a letter that had arrived on the last mail sled. Around midnight, the shouting stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete and unnatural that it made my skin crawl, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for some sign that Margaret was still alive. The snow was falling harder, now thick flakes that seemed to swallow sound itself, and in that eerie quiet, I heard the cabin door creak open and footsteps crunching through the fresh powder. I crept to my window and peered through the frost-covered glass, watching as a small figure in a dark coat moved away from the Holloway cabin and into the swirling white darkness beyond. But what I saw next would haunt me for the rest of my days, because trailing behind that figure were not one, but two sets of footprints leading into the unforgiving Alaskan night. The blizzard that began that night was unlike anything Juneau had seen in a decade, with winds that could knock a grown man off his feet and snow that fell so thick you couldn't see your own hand extended in front of your face. I spent the dark hours pacing my cabin floor, listening for any sound from next door, any indication that Margaret had returned safely from whatever desperate mission had driven her out into that hellish storm. By morning, the world had been transformed into a white wasteland, with drifts piled so high against the cabins that some folks had to dig tunnels just to reach their front doors. Thomas emerged around noon, stumbling through the snow like a man in a daze, his face pale and his hands shaking as he knocked on cabin doors throughout our small settlement. "Has anyone seen Margaret?" he kept asking, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine panic, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't quite right, wasn't quite the look of a man whose wife had simply gotten lost in a storm. I watched him from my window as he organized search parties, watched the way he kept glancing back toward the tree line where those two sets of footprints had long since been buried under fresh snow. But what struck me most was how he never once suggested we follow the path she'd taken into the forest. Instead, he kept insisting she must have gotten turned around trying to reach the general store, must have wandered off in the wrong direction. The search for Margaret Holloway lasted 6 days, with every able-bodied man in Juneau braving the continuing storms to comb through the wilderness surrounding our little settlement. We found her shawl hanging from a spruce branch about a mile from town, torn and stained with what might have been blood, but the snow had covered any tracks that could have led us further. Old Pete Morrison, who'd been trapping these mountains since before Alaska was even a territory, shook his head grimly as he examined the fabric, muttering something about how the wilderness up here had a way of swallowing people whole, leaving nothing behind but questions and grief. The temperature never rose above 20 below during those search days, and more than one rescuer suffered frostbite that would claim fingers and toes. But we kept looking because Margaret was one of us, and in a place as isolated as Juneau, every life mattered. On the 7th day, Sheriff Mackenzie called off the official search, declaring Margaret Holloway presumed dead, victim of exposure in the December blizzard of 1904, but I knew the truth was buried somewhere deeper than the snow. Thomas accepted the condolences of his neighbors with dry eyes and steady hands, and within a month he'd packed up everything and disappeared on the next steamer back to Seattle, leaving behind only empty cabins and whispers that would echo through Juneau for generations. But I stayed, and I kept watching those woods, and I never stopped wondering about those two sets of footprints I'd seen that night, because somewhere in my heart I knew that Margaret's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thomas Holloway was a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains he worked, with hands that could crush ore and a heart that seemed just as cold and unyielding. I'd known him for 5 years before Margaret came into his life, and in all that time, I'd never seen him show kindness to anything living. Not to the sled dogs that pulled his supplies up the mountain, not to the other miners who shared his claim, and certainly not to the delicate woman from Seattle who'd made the mistake of believing his promises of gold and a better life. He stood 6 feet tall in his work boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry timber, and a beard so thick with ice most winter days that it looked like armor plating his jaw. His eyes were the color of glacial ice, pale blue and just as cold. And when he looked at you, it felt like he was calculating your worth down to the last cent. The other miners respected him because he could work longer and harder than any man in the territory, but they also feared him because Thomas had a reputation for settling disputes with his fists rather than his words. When he brought Margaret back from his trip to Seattle in the spring of 1901, we all wondered what a refined city woman could possibly see in a man who seemed more beast than human. But what we didn't know then, what none of us could have imagined, was that Thomas Holloway's silence hid secrets darker than the deepest mine shaft, and his marriage to Margaret was just another claim he intended to work until there was nothing left to extract. The lucky strike claim that Thomas worked sat high up on Mount Juneau, a treacherous climb that took the better part of a day even in good weather, and during the winter months, it might as well have been on the moon for all the contact he had with the rest of us. He'd disappear for weeks at a time, leaving Margaret alone in their cabin with barely enough firewood to keep the place warm and just enough canned goods to keep her from starving. I tried to help when I could, splitting extra wood and leaving it by their door, bringing her fresh rabbit when my traps were full, but Thomas had made it clear that he didn't want anyone getting too friendly with his wife. "She's got everything she needs," he'd growl whenever someone suggested that maybe Margaret could use some company during those long stretches when he was up the mountain. But we all knew that what she needed most was human kindness, and that was the one thing Thomas seemed incapable of providing. The few times I managed to speak with her when Thomas was away, she'd tell me stories about Seattle, about the electric lights and the streetcars, and the theaters where people dressed in fine clothes and forgot about the cold for a few hours. Her eyes would light up when she talked about her old life, but then she'd catch herself and that light would die out, replaced by the resigned sadness of someone who'd realized she'd traded her freedom for a wedding ring and a one-way ticket to the edge of the world. What troubled me most about Thomas wasn't his coldness or even his cruelty. It was the way he watched Margaret when he thought no one was looking, like a prospector studying a vein of ore, calculating how much value he could extract before the whole thing played out. He'd installed thick curtains in their cabin windows within a month of bringing her home, claiming it was to keep the heat in during winter. But I suspected it was more about keeping prying eyes out and Margaret in. During his brief returns from the mine, I'd see shadows moving behind those curtains, hear muffled conversations that never sounded like the gentle words between husband and wife, but more like negotiations between a buyer and seller. Thomas never brought Margaret into town for the monthly socials at the church, never let her join the other wives for their quilting circles or tea gatherings, and when anyone asked about her health or happiness, his answer was always the same. "She's adjusting to Alaska just fine." Oh, but I could see from my window how she'd stand at her door after he left each morning, watching his figure disappear up the mountain path, and the expression on her face wasn't relief or longing. It was the look of a prisoner counting down the days until her sentence was served. The most disturbing thing was how she'd started flinching whenever someone knocked on her door, even when Thomas was miles away up at the claim, as if she'd been trained to expect pain from any unexpected sound. The night before Margaret disappeared, Thomas returned from what should have been a routine supply run to the Lucky Strike, but something was different about him. There was an agitation in his movements, a nervous energy that I'd never seen before in a man who usually moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned to conserve every ounce of strength for survival. He spent an hour unloading his pack mule, but instead of the usual mining equipment and provisions, he seemed to be carrying mostly papers and small packages, things he handled with unusual care before disappearing into the cabin. Through the thin walls, I could hear him and Margaret talking in hushed, urgent tones, their voices rising and falling like they were arguing about something that couldn't wait until morning. At one point, I heard Margaret cry out, not in pain, but in shock, as if Thomas had told her something that knocked the breath right out of her lungs. The conversation went on for hours, and sometime around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of Thomas's heavy work boots pacing back and forth across their wooden floor, wearing a path like a caged animal. When morning came, Thomas emerged, looking like he hadn't slept at all, his usual composure replaced by a jittery alertness that reminded me of a man who'd been caught in a lie and was trying to figure out how to cover his tracks. He spent the day cleaning his rifle with an intensity that seemed excessive even for a man heading back into bear country, and more than once I caught him staring off toward the tree line with an expression I couldn't quite read. That evening, as the snow began to fall, I watched Thomas through my frosted window as he stood in his doorway, having what appeared to be a final conversation with Margaret before heading back up to the mine. But something about their body language struck me as wrong. There was no goodbye kiss, no tender farewell between husband and wife, just Thomas speaking in sharp, clipped sentences while Margaret stood rigid as a fence post, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something together that was threatening to fall apart. When Thomas finally shouldered his pack and started up the mountain path, He didn't look back once, and Margaret didn't wave. She just stood there in the doorway until his lantern light disappeared into the falling snow, then closed the door with a sound like the lid of a coffin slamming shut. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until decades later when the truth finally came to light, was that Thomas hadn't gone up to the Lucky Strike that night at all. He'd circled back through the woods and hidden himself in the old trapper's cabin about half a mile from town, waiting and watching for something that he knew was coming. The next morning, when he came stumbling into town claiming his wife had vanished in the blizzard, his boots were clean of the kind of ice and snow that should have accumulated during a night spent hiking up a mountain trail, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't grief or panic. It was the cold satisfaction of a man whose plans had finally come together exactly as he'd hoped. The days following Margaret's disappearance revealed a side of Thomas that few of us had seen before, and it wasn't the broken-hearted widower we expected, but something far more calculated and disturbing. He organized the search parties with military precision, assigning each group to specific areas, while always ensuring that he controlled which sections of the wilderness we covered and which we avoided. When old Pete Morrison suggested we expand the search to include the abandoned mining camps higher up the mountain, Thomas quickly dismissed the idea, claiming the terrain was too dangerous and Margaret wouldn't have had any reason to go that direction. He kept detailed notes about every clue we found, or rather, every clue he wanted us to find, and I noticed how he always seemed to be the one who discovered the most significant pieces of evidence, like Margaret's torn shawl and the single glove we found near Auk Bay. Most telling of all was his behavior during the evening hours, when exhausted search parties would gather at the general store to warm up and share information about the day's efforts. While the rest of us nursed our frostbite and worried about Margaret's fate, Thomas would sit apart from the group, methodically cleaning his fingernails with his pocket knife and watching our faces with those pale blue eyes, as if he was studying our reactions to determine how much we believed and how much we suspected. On the final day of the search, when Sheriff Mackenzie officially declared Margaret dead and called off the rescue efforts, Thomas nodded solemnly and thanked everyone for their help, but I swear I saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like relief. Within hours of the sheriff's announcement, Thomas was already packing his belongings, claiming that Juneau held too many painful memories and he needed to return to Seattle to start fresh. But what kind of man abandons his wife's grave and the place where they'd built their life together unless he knows for certain that neither the grave nor the life had ever been real to begin with? The rescue that changed everything began on the third day of searching, when young Billy Mackenzie, the sheriff's nephew who'd come up from Ketchikan for the winter, came running into town with his face flushed red from cold and excitement, claiming he'd seen smoke rising from somewhere near the Mendenhall Glacier. Most of us were ready to dismiss it as wishful thinking or maybe just steam from the hot springs that bubbled up through the ice in that treacherous country. But Billy swore on his grandmother's Bible that it was wood smoke, the kind that comes from a cabin fire, and he'd tracked it to a place where no cabin should have existed. The glacier was nearly 10 miles from town, across terrain so dangerous that even the most experienced trappers avoided it during winter months, and the idea that Margaret could have made it that far in a blizzard seemed impossible. But then, again, desperation could drive a person to accomplish things that defied all logic and reason. Thomas immediately volunteered to lead the rescue party to investigate Billy's claim, and I remember thinking at the time how eager he seemed to take control of this particular search, how his pale blue eyes lit up with something that looked almost like anticipation rather than hope. We gathered our supplies quickly: rope, blankets, medical kit, and enough food for 2 days in case we got trapped by weather. But as we prepared to leave, I noticed Thomas checking and rechecking his rifle, and when someone asked why he needed so much ammunition for a rescue mission, he just muttered something about wolves and turned away. But what struck me most was the way he kept glancing toward the tree line, as if he was looking for something or someone who might be watching us, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The journey to the glacier was a nightmare of ice and wind that tested every man among us to his breaking point, with snow so deep in places that we had to take turns breaking trail, each man leading for 10 minutes before exhaustion forced him to fall back and let the next take over. The cold was so intense that our breath froze in our beards, forming ice masks that made speaking difficult and breathing even harder. and more than once we had to stop to thaw out frost-bitten fingers and toes before permanent damage set in. Thomas pushed us harder than necessary, setting a pace that left several of the older men gasping and struggling to keep up, claiming that every minute could mean the difference between finding Margaret alive or finding her frozen corpse. But I noticed that he seemed to know exactly where he was going, never hesitating at the various game trails and creek crossings that could easily confuse a man in those whiteout conditions. And when we finally reached the area where Billy had seen the smoke, Thomas was the first to spot the narrow canyon that led toward the glacier's edge. The wind in that canyon howled like something alive and hungry, funneling down from the ice fields above with enough force to knock a man off his feet. And the temperature dropped so quickly that our exposed skin began to burn within minutes. But Thomas pressed forward with single-minded determination, and the rest of us followed because abandoning a search party in that wilderness would have been tantamount to murder. What we found at the end of that frozen canyon defied everything. We thought we knew about the wilderness and about Margaret Holloway's chances of survival, because tucked into a natural shelter formed by fallen boulders and overhanging ice was a crude lean-to made from spruce branches and salvaged canvas, with the remains of a small fire still smoldering despite the wind. The shelter was barely large enough for one person to lie down in, but it had been cleverly positioned to take advantage of the rock's windbreak and the residual heat that rose from the glacier's underlying thermal activity. Inside, we found signs that someone had been living there for at least 2 days. A few empty tin cans, some melted snow in a makeshift pot, and most remarkably, a pile of pine needles arranged like a bed, still holding the impression of a human form. But there was no Margaret, just the ghost of her presence, and a trail of footprints leading further into the maze of ice and stone that surrounded the glacier's terminus. Thomas studied those tracks with an intensity that bordered on obsession, kneeling in the snow to examine every detail while the rest of us stood shivering and wondering how a delicate woman from Seattle had managed to build such an effective survival shelter. When Billy suggested we should split up to follow the different sets of tracks radiating out from the lean-to, Thomas quickly vetoed the idea, insisting that we needed to stay together in such dangerous terrain. But I noticed that his eyes kept returning to one particular set of prints that led toward a crevasse field where the glacier had cracked and shifted, creating a deadly labyrinth of hidden ice bridges and bottomless chasms. The sound that stopped us in our tracks came just as we were preparing to follow Margaret's trail deeper into the glacier complex. A human voice, weak and distant, but unmistakably, calling for help, echoing off the ice walls in a way that made it impossible to determine which direction it was coming from. We all froze, straining our ears against the constant moan of wind through the crevasses, and there it was again. "Help me, please." So faint it might have been our imagination, but desperate enough to send every man in our party scrambling in different directions. Thomas immediately took charge, shouting orders about rope teams and safety protocols, but I could see something in his face that looked more like panic than leadership, a wild-eyed urgency that didn't match the careful precision he'd shown throughout the rest of the search. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere below us, down in the maze of ice cracks and hidden chambers that honeycombed the glacier's edge, and as we rigged ropes and prepared for what could be a deadly descent, I realized that Thomas kept positioning himself to be the first one down into those icy depths. But when we finally lowered him into the largest crevasse, secured by 3 separate rope lines and equipped with lanterns and medical supplies, what we hauled back up 20 minutes later wasn't Margaret at all. It was something that would change everything we thought we understood about her disappearance and about the kind of man Thomas Holloway really was. Because clinging to Thomas's arm as we pulled them both to safety was a woman we'd never seen before, half frozen and delirious with cold, but very much alive and speaking in a foreign accent about a cabin in the woods and a man who'd promised to help her reach her family in Vancouver. The woman we rescued from the glacier was barely conscious when we first brought her to the surface, her lips blue with hypothermia and her dark hair matted with ice. But as we worked to warm her with blankets and hot tea from our thermos, she began to speak in broken English mixed with what sounded like Norwegian or Swedish. Her name, she told us through chattering teeth, was Ingrid Larson, And she'd been traveling alone from Skagway to meet her brother in Vancouver when her guide had abandoned her at a remote cabin 3 days' journey from Juneau. She'd been trying to reach town for help when the blizzard hit, forcing her to take shelter wherever she could find it. And she'd been living in that makeshift lean-to for 4 days, surviving on cached supplies she'd found in an old trapper's cache and melted snow. But what made my blood run cold was her description of the cabin where she'd been abandoned, a small log structure with thick curtains over the windows, located about half a mile from a mining settlement, where a tall man with pale eyes had promised to guide her safely to the coast in exchange for the gold coins sewn into her coat lining. Thomas's face went white as fresh snow when Ingrid described this man, and I saw his hands shake as he helped lift her onto the improvised stretcher we'd rigged for the journey back to town. But most disturbing of all was what Ingrid whispered to me as we prepared to carry her down from the glacier, that in the cabin where she'd been abandoned, she'd found a woman's clothing hidden under a loose floorboard, along with letters addressed to someone named Margaret Holloway, and a small leather journal filled with desperate pleas for help that would never be answered. The journey back to Juneau with Ingrid Larson took twice as long as our trip to the glacier, partly because of the stretcher and partly because Thomas seemed determined to take every wrong turn and follow every false trail that could delay our return to town. He claimed he was being extra cautious because of Ingrid's condition, but I could see something darker in his behavior. A desperate urgency to control what she might tell the sheriff, coupled with a growing panic about what other secrets might surface once word of her rescue spread through the community. During our rest stops, when Ingrid was coherent enough to talk, she kept returning to her description of the mysterious guide who'd promised to help her, and each new detail made Thomas more agitated. The man's knowledge of hidden trails, his cache of supplies in remote locations, his particular interest in travelers carrying gold or valuable goods. But what seemed to terrify Thomas most was Ingrid's insistence that she hadn't been his first victim, that she'd found evidence in that abandoned cabin suggesting other travelers had been lured there under false pretenses, stripped of their valuables, and left to die in the wilderness. By the time we reached the outskirts of Juneau, Thomas was moving like a man walking to his own execution, and I realized that our rescue of Ingrid Larson hadn't just saved one life, it had exposed a predator who'd been using the isolation and harsh conditions of the Alaskan wilderness to prey on desperate people seeking passage to safety. But the most chilling revelation was still to come, because as we carried Ingrid toward the doctor's office, she grabbed my sleeve with her frostbitten fingers and whispered the words that would haunt me for decades. The woman in the cabin. She wasn't dead when he left her there. I could hear her crying through the floorboards, begging someone named Thomas to forgive her for whatever she'd done wrong. The truth about Margaret Holloway began to surface 3 days after we brought Ingrid Larson back to town, when Sheriff Mackenzie and I returned to that abandoned cabin she'd described, armed with shovels, lanterns, and a growing certainty that we were about to uncover something that would change Juneau forever. The cabin sat exactly where Ingrid had said it would, tucked into a grove of ancient spruce trees about half a mile from the main settlement, close enough that smoke from its chimney should have been visible on clear days, yet somehow none of us had ever noticed it before. The structure itself was well built, but deliberately concealed, with its roof covered in moss and fallen branches to blend with the forest canopy, and approach trails that had been carefully disguised to look like natural game paths. Inside, the air carried the stench of fear and desperation that seems to soak into wood when terrible things happen within walls, and as our lantern light pushed back the shadows, I could see why Ingrid had been so disturbed by what she'd found there. The main room showed signs of recent habitation, a cold fireplace filled with ash, canned goods stacked on makeshift shelves, and several sets of men's clothing, hanging from pegs driven into the log walls. But it was the loose floorboard in the far corner that drew our attention, because when we pried it up with a crowbar, we found a space underneath that had been deliberately hollowed out to create a hiding place for things that were never meant to see daylight. And what we pulled from that dark cavity would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. Because it wasn't just Margaret's belongings we found, it was evidence of a horror that had been unfolding in our community for years while we remained blind to the evil living among us. The leather journal that Ingrid had mentioned was the first thing Sheriff Mackenzie pulled from beneath the floorboards. its pages filled with Margaret's delicate handwriting, documenting weeks of terror that began long before her disappearance. The entries started innocent enough, describing her loneliness during Thomas's long absences and her growing suspicion that he was hiding something from her. But as I read by the flickering lantern light, Margaret's words became increasingly desperate and frightened. She wrote about finding strange belongings in their cabin, clothes that didn't belong to either of them, jewelry that looked foreign, coins from countries she'd never heard of, and about the way Thomas would disappear for days at a time, returning with more supplies than any legitimate mining operation could justify. But most chilling were her descriptions of the sounds she heard coming from the root cellar beneath their cabin during the nights when Thomas was supposedly away at the Lucky Strike claim, muffled voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize, crying that would suddenly stop in the middle of the night, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor above her head. Margaret had tried to investigate these mysterious sounds, but Thomas had installed a heavy padlock on the cellar door, claiming it was to keep animals out of their food stores, though Margaret noted that she'd never seen him go down there to retrieve anything for their meals. The final entry in the journal was dated December 15, 1904, the day before Margaret disappeared, and it contained a single line written in shaking handwriting. "He knows that I know, and I think he's going to kill me tonight." Beneath Margaret's journal, we found a collection of personal items that told a story more horrific than anything I could have imagined, because they belonged not just to Margaret, but to at least 6 other people who had vanished without a trace over the past 3 years. There was a man's pocket watch engraved with Norwegian text, a woman's silver locket containing the photograph of 2 small children, a leather wallet with identification papers for someone named Klaus Bergman, who'd been traveling from Skagway to Seattle in the spring of 1902. Each item represented a life cut short, a family somewhere that had never learned what happened to their loved one who'd set out for the promise of a better life in Alaska and instead found death in the wilderness. Sheriff Mackenzie cataloged each piece of evidence with the grim efficiency of a man who'd seen too much evil in his years of law enforcement, but I could see his hands shaking as he handled a child's wooden toy, a small carved horse that had probably been clutched in terrified fingers during someone's final moments. The most disturbing discovery was a bundle of letters written in different hands in various languages, but all containing similar themes: desperate pleas for help, descriptions of being held prisoner in a remote cabin, and frantic promises to pay any ransom if only someone would rescue them from their captivity. These weren't the random belongings of travelers who'd died from exposure or accident. They were the trophies of a predator who'd systematically hunted human prey across the Alaskan wilderness, using the harsh climate and vast distances to cover his tracks and dispose of evidence that would never be found in more civilized places. The root cellar beneath the Holloway cabin revealed the full scope of Thomas's depravity when we finally broke through the padlocked door and descended into that chamber of horrors with our lanterns held high and our hearts heavy with dread. The smell hit us first, the sweet, sickening odor of decomposition mixed with lime and the acrid scent of fear that seemed to have soaked into the very walls of that underground tomb. The cellar was larger than it should have been, extending well beyond the footprint of the cabin above, with rough-hewn walls that showed evidence of recent excavation and a floor that had been disturbed and repacked multiple times. Along one wall we found shackles bolted into the stone foundation, their metal surfaces stained with rust and worse, positioned at heights that would accommodate both adults and children in various states of restraint. But it was the collection of belongings stacked along the opposite wall that truly revealed the magnitude of Thomas's crimes. Dozens of suitcases, traveling bags, and personal effects that represented years of systematic murder disguised as the normal hazards of Alaskan travel. Each bag had been carefully emptied of anything valuable, with the gold, jewelry, and currency long since converted to Thomas's use. But the personal items remained like accusatory ghosts: family photographs, love letters, children's drawings, and religious tokens that had failed to protect their owners from the monster who'd lured them to their deaths. The sheriff counted evidence from at least 12 separate victims, though we suspected there were more whose remains had been disposed of in the glacier crevasses and mine shafts that honeycombed the mountains around Juneau, places where bodies would never be recovered and questions would never be answered. The most horrific discovery came when we began examining the disturbed areas of the cellar floor, because the lime that Thomas had used to accelerate decomposition had only partially done its work, leaving behind fragments of bone and fabric that told the story of his victim's final hours. Sheriff Mackenzie, who'd served in the Spanish-American War and seen his share of battlefield carnage, had to step outside twice to compose himself as we carefully excavated the makeshift graves that Thomas had dug beneath his own home. Among the remains, we found pieces of jewelry that matched descriptions from missing person reports filed in Skagway, Sitka, and even as far south as Seattle. Confirmation that Thomas's hunting ground had extended far beyond our isolated community. But the discovery that broke my heart was a small section of blue fabric that I recognized as coming from the dress Margaret had been wearing the morning before she disappeared, buried in the newest section of disturbed earth along with fragments of bone that were too fresh to have been there long. The implications were clear and terrible. Margaret hadn't escaped into the blizzard that night. She'd been murdered in her own home and buried beneath the floorboards while her husband played the role of grieving widower for the entire town. The only question that remained was whether she'd died quickly, or whether Thomas had kept her alive long enough to extract whatever information or confession he'd been seeking. And based on the evidence we were uncovering, I feared we all knew the answer to that question. The final piece of evidence that sealed Thomas Holloway's fate came when we discovered his detailed record-keeping hidden behind a false wall in the cabin's main room, because this monster had documented every aspect of his crimes with the methodical precision of a bookkeeper recording business transactions. The ledger contained names, dates, locations of capture, methods of disposal, and even financial calculations showing the profit he'd made from each victim's belongings, a cold-blooded accounting of human lives reduced to monetary value. Margaret's entry was the last one in the book, dated December 16, 1904, with notations indicating that she'd discovered his operation and threatened to expose him to the authorities, making her elimination a necessary business decision rather than a crime of passion. But what chilled me to the bone was the section labeled Future Targets, which contained detailed information about other travelers expected to pass through Juneau in the coming months, including their estimated wealth, travel routes, and planned destinations. Thomas hadn't just been a killer of opportunity. He'd been running a systematic hunting operation that used the isolation and harsh conditions of Alaska to prey on the vulnerable and desperate, and he would have continued his slaughter indefinitely if Ingrid Larson hadn't survived long enough to expose him. As we stood in that charnel house beneath the cabin where Margaret had lived and died, I realized that our quiet little mining community had been harboring one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, a man who'd turned the promise of gold and new beginnings into a lure for death, and whose evil had been hidden beneath a veneer of respectability that had fooled us all for far too long. The whispers beneath the ice had finally been heard, and the truth they revealed would ensure that Thomas Holloway's name would be remembered not as a successful miner, but as the monster who turned the last frontier into a hunting ground for human prey. 43 years had passed since Margaret Holloway's disappearance when the photograph arrived at my cabin door on a gray October morning in 1947, carried by a young postal clerk who had no idea he was delivering a message from beyond the grave. I was 71 years old by then, my hair white as the snow that had buried so many secrets in Juneau, and my hands bore the permanent stains of a lifetime spent mining for gold that always seemed to slip through my fingers like water. The years since Thomas Holloway's exposure and eventual capture had been kind to our little town. We'd grown from a rough collection of cabins into a proper settlement with electric lights, telephone lines, and even a small hotel for the tourists who came to see the glacier. But I'd never forgotten the whispers beneath the ice, never stopped wondering about the victims whose names we'd never learned, never stopped seeing Margaret's face in my dreams, frozen in that moment of terror when she realized her husband meant to kill her. The envelope that morning was thick and yellowed with age, addressed in careful handwriting to Jacob Morrison, witness to the Holloway affair, and as I tore it open with trembling fingers, I felt the same chill I'd experienced that December night in 1904 when I'd watched 2 sets of footprints disappear into the blizzard, but nothing could have prepared me for what spilled out onto my kitchen table. a collection of photographs that would finally answer the question that had haunted me for nearly half a century. What had really happened to Margaret Holloway after she walked into that storm? The letter that accompanied the photographs was written in the shaky hand of someone very old, and it came from a woman named Catherine Brennan in San Francisco, who explained that she was the daughter of Dr. Michael Sullivan, the physician who had treated survivors of the great San Francisco earthquake in 1906. According to Catherine's letter, her father had kept detailed medical records of everyone he'd treated in the aftermath of that disaster, including a woman who'd been found wandering the ruins with severe frostbite, partial memory loss, and injuries consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme cold. The woman had no identification, could remember only fragments of her past, and spoke with terror about ice and snow and a man with pale blue eyes who had tried to kill her. But she was very much alive, and she had spent the rest of her life in California under the name Mary Sullivan, having been informally adopted by the doctor who'd saved her. Catherine's letter explained that Mary had lived a quiet life as a seamstress and housekeeper, never fully recovering her memories, but always haunted by nightmares about Alaska and a husband who had betrayed her trust in the most fundamental way. When Mary died in 1945 at the age of 64, she'd left behind a small collection of personal items, including several photographs that she'd treasured despite not being able to remember how she'd obtained them. Catherine had spent 2 years trying to identify the people in those photographs, following leads that eventually brought her to the newspaper archives covering the Holloway case, and she'd decided to send them to me because I'd been mentioned in several articles as the key witness who'd helped expose Thomas's crimes. The first photograph I examined showed a group of people standing in front of what was unmistakably the Seattle waterfront, with Margaret Holloway clearly visible in the center of the frame. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her with his arm around her waist was a man who definitely wasn't Thomas, a younger fellow with kind eyes and a gentle smile that spoke of genuine affection rather than possessive control. The photograph was dated 1900 on the back in Margaret's handwriting, along with the words, "My darling William, before everything changed," and as I studied the image more closely, I realized that Margaret had been involved with someone else before. Thomas had entered her life, someone who might have represented the happiness and security she'd been seeking when she'd agreed to marry a miner and move to Alaska. But it was the second photograph that made my heart race with possibilities I'd never considered, because it showed Margaret standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, wearing clothes that were clearly more expensive and fashionable than anything I'd ever seen her wear in Juneau, and she was holding what appeared to be a small child, a little girl with Margaret's distinctive auburn hair and green eyes. The photograph was undated, but based on Margaret's appearance and the child's size, it had to have been taken sometime after 1904, which meant that not only had Margaret survived her disappearance from Juneau, but she'd somehow managed to build a new life that included the family she'd always wanted, but had never been able to have with Thomas. The implications of this discovery hit me like a physical blow, because it meant that everything we'd believed about Margaret's fate had been wrong, and that somewhere in the ruins and chaos of that hidden cabin, she'd found the strength and cunning to escape from a man who'd killed at least a dozen other people without mercy or remorse. The third photograph in Catherine's collection was the one that finally made sense of Margaret's incredible escape, because it showed her standing next to a train in what appeared to be a railroad station, accompanied by 2 other women and a man who looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place where I might have seen him before. Margaret was wearing men's clothing in this image, heavy wool pants, a thick coat, and sturdy boots that would have been suitable for wilderness travel. And there was something different about her posture and expression, a confidence and determination that I'd never seen during her years in Juneau. The back of the photograph contained a note in Margaret's handwriting that read, "Leaving Skagway with the Andersons, February 1905, finally free." And suddenly I understood how she'd managed to disappear so completely that even Thomas's eventual confession hadn't revealed what had actually happened to her. Margaret hadn't died in that cabin as we'd all assumed. She'd somehow escaped during the chaos of Thomas's operation, probably when he was dealing with other victims, and she'd made her way to Skagway where she'd found passage south under Toph assumed identity. The timing made perfect sense because Thomas had been so focused on covering up his crimes and maintaining his cover story about Margaret's death that he might not have immediately realized she'd escaped rather than simply died in the wilderness as he'd planned. But what struck me most about this photograph was the expression on Margaret's face. There was no fear there, no trace of the terrorized victim I'd seen in her final days in Juneau, but instead the look of a woman who had fought for her life, and one who had turned the tables on a predator and claimed her freedom through sheer force of will. The final photograph in the collection was dated 1910 and showed Margaret, now calling herself Mary Sullivan, standing in front of a small house in San Francisco, surrounded by what was clearly her new family, Dr. Sullivan and his wife, the little girl from the earlier photograph who was now perhaps 6 years old, and 2 other children who had obviously been born after Margaret's arrival in California. She looked healthy and content in a way I'd never seen during her time in Alaska, her face filled with the warmth and joy that comes from finally finding safety and belonging after years of fear and isolation. The back of the photograph contained a message that Catherine had copied from her father's papers. Mary insists she doesn't remember her life before the earthquake, but sometimes she talks in her sleep about snow and wolves and a man with ice-cold eyes who tried to bury her alive. We've learned not to ask questions about her past, because the important thing is that she's here with us now, and she's finally learned what it means to be loved without conditions or fear. As I sat in my kitchen that October morning, holding these photographs that had traveled across 4 decades to reach me, I felt a mixture of joy and sorrow that threatened to overwhelm my aging heart. Joy because Margaret had survived and built the life she'd always dreamed of. Sorrow because she'd lived those years believing she was alone in the world, never knowing that people in Juneau had cared about her fate and mourned her supposed death. But most of all, I felt a deep sense of justice finally being served, because Margaret Holloway had accomplished something that none of Thomas's other victims had managed. She'd escaped from a monster and lived to build a better world for herself and the children who'd become her family. The revelation that Margaret had survived fundamentally changed how I understood everything that had happened during that terrible winter of 1904, because it meant that Thomas's carefully constructed story about her death had been built on a foundation of lies even more complex than we'd realized. When Thomas had returned to town, claiming his wife had vanished in the blizzard, he'd probably believed she was dead, either from exposure after escaping from his cabin prison or from injuries he'd inflicted before she'd managed to get away. His performance as the grieving widower had been so convincing because he genuinely thought he was a widower, and his eventual confession to Sheriff Mackenzie had included details about Margaret's murder that he'd assumed rather than remembered, because he'd never actually succeeded in killing her. This explained why we'd never found Margaret's body in the root cellar beneath their cabin, why the physical evidence of her death had been so sparse compared to his other victims, and why Thomas had seemed genuinely surprised when investigators had pressed him for specifics about how he'd disposed of her remains. But it also meant that Margaret had spent the final months of 1904 and the early part of 1905 engaged in a desperate game of survival, staying one step ahead of a husband who would have killed her the moment he realized she was still alive, using her intelligence and resourcefulness to not only escape from Juneau, but to create an entirely new identity that would keep her safe from his reach, forever. As I carefully placed the photographs back in their envelope, I realized that Margaret Holloway's story wasn't just about surviving a serial killer. It was about a woman finding the strength to reclaim her life from someone who'd tried to reduce her to nothing more than another entry in his ledger of victims, and in doing so, she'd achieved something that was perhaps more remarkable than simple survival. She'd won. The final truth about Margaret Holloway's escape came to me 3 months after the photographs arrived, when Catherine Brennan traveled all the way from San Francisco to Juneau to deliver the rest of her adoptive mother's story in person, and what she revealed would forever change how I understood the power of human resilience in the face of unspeakable evil. Catherine was a woman in her 40s with Margaret's same green eyes and gentle demeanor, but there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of someone who had been raised by a survivor, someone who had learned from an early age that even the most impossible situations could be overcome with courage and determination. She arrived on a gray November day that reminded me painfully of that December night in 1904 when everything had begun. And as we sat in my kitchen with the wind howling outside my windows, she opened a worn leather satchel and began to piece together the final chapters of a story that had haunted me for nearly half a century. What Catherine told me over the course of that long afternoon would prove that Margaret's escape hadn't been a matter of luck or accident, but the result of careful planning and extraordinary bravery that had turned her from victim into victor in a battle that most people would never have survived. But more than that, Catherine's revelations would show me that the ripples of Margaret's courage had spread far beyond her own life, touching dozens of other people who had found hope and safety because one woman had refused to let evil triumph over good. Catherine began her story by explaining that Mary Sullivan, the woman we had known as Margaret Holloway, had never truly lost her memory as her adoptive family had believed, but had instead made a conscious decision to bury her past, in order to protect both herself and the people who had saved her. In the final months of her life, when Mary knew she was dying from the cancer that would eventually claim her, she had finally opened up to Catherine about her true identity and the events that had brought her to California, revealing a tale of survival that was far more complex and harrowing than anything we had imagined. According to Catherine, Margaret's escape from Thomas's cabin prison had been the result of weeks of careful observation and planning, during which she had identified the patterns of his operation and found ways to turn his own methodical nature against him. She had discovered that Thomas kept detailed schedules of his victims' arrival and disposal times, and she had used this information to plan her break for freedom during a window when she knew he would be away from the cabin dealing with other aspects of his murderous business. But what made her escape possible wasn't just timing. It was the alliance she had formed with two other prisoners who were being held in that underground chamber, a Norwegian immigrant named Eric Anderson and his teenage daughter Astrid, who had been captured while trying to reach Seattle, but had managed to survive longer than Thomas's other victims because of Eric's knowledge of wilderness survival. Together, the three of them had planned an escape that would not only free them from their prison, but would also expose Thomas's operation to the authorities, ensuring that no other innocent travelers would fall victim to his predatory schemes. The escape itself had taken place on the night of December 15, 1904, the same night I had seen two sets of footprints leading away from the Holloway cabin, and it had been far more elaborate than a simple flight into the wilderness. Margaret had spent weeks loosening the floorboards above the root cellar where she and the Andersons were being held, using a small knife she had hidden in her clothing to slowly work away the wood and nails that secured their prison ceiling. On the night of their planned escape, when Thomas left the cabin to dispose of the body of his most recent victim, Margaret had led Eric and Astrid up through the loosened floorboards and into the main cabin, where they had gathered evidence of Thomas's crimes before setting the building ablaze to destroy any remaining traces of his operation. But Margaret's plan had gone beyond simple destruction. She had also retrieved her personal journal and several letters she had written documenting Thomas's suspicious behavior, items she intended to deliver to the authorities as proof of his guilt. The fire had been meant to look like an accident, giving the three escapees time to reach Skagway before Thomas realized what had happened, and the two sets of footprints I had seen that night had belonged to Margaret and Astrid, who had been traveling together while Eric scouted ahead to ensure their route was safe. Their journey to Skagway had taken 6 days through some of the most dangerous terrain in Alaska, but Eric's wilderness skills and Margaret's determination had kept them alive long enough to reach the port town, where they had used false names to book passage on a steamship bound for Seattle. Catherine's most remarkable revelation was that Margaret's escape had not been the end of her involvement in bringing Thomas Holloway to justice, but rather the beginning of a campaign that had ultimately led to his capture and conviction. Once safely in California, Margaret had used her connections with Dr. Sullivan and his network of reform-minded friends to ensure that the evidence she had gathered reached the proper authorities, and she had provided detailed testimony that had helped investigators understand the full scope of Thomas's crimes. But more than that, Margaret had used her new identity as Mary Sullivan to create a network of safe houses and support systems for other survivors of violent crimes, turning her own experience of victimization into a force for protecting others who found themselves in similar situations. Catherine showed me letters that Mary had written to women's shelters in Seattle, Portland and San Francisco, offering financial support and practical advice for helping victims of domestic violence escape from their abusers and rebuild their lives in safety. She had also worked quietly with immigration organizations to identify and assist travelers who might be vulnerable to the kind of predatory schemes that Thomas had operated, using her knowledge of his methods to help others recognize and avoid similar dangers. In essence, Margaret Holloway had spent the 40 years following her escape not just surviving, but actively working to ensure that Thomas's legacy would be one of justice served rather than evil triumphant. The final piece of the puzzle came when Catherine showed me a letter that Mary had written shortly before her death, addressed to me specifically and intended to be delivered only after she had passed away, because she had wanted to thank the people in Juneau who had cared enough about her disappearance to search for her and had worked to expose Thomas's crimes. In that letter, Margaret expressed her gratitude for the kindness I had shown her during her darkest days in Alaska, and she revealed that she had always known I was watching over her welfare, even when Thomas's control had made it impossible for her to acknowledge my concern. She wrote about the comfort she had drawn from knowing that there were good people in Juneau who would have helped her if they had understood the danger she was facing, and she credited that knowledge with giving her the strength to believe that escape was possible and that life could be better somewhere else. But what moved me most was Margaret's description of how her experience in Alaska had shaped her understanding of human nature, teaching her that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades, but also that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacity for courage and compassion when faced with injustice. She had used this knowledge to guide her work helping other victims, and she had passed it on to Catherine and her other children, creating a legacy of service that extended far beyond her own survival, to touch the lives of countless people who had found hope in their darkest moments because Margaret Holloway had refused to let Thomas Holloway's evil define the limits of what was possible. As I read her final words to me, the snow in Alaska buried many secrets, but it could not freeze the warmth of human kindness or the power of hope to bloom even in the coldest places. I felt a peace I hadn't known since that terrible winter of 1904, because I finally understood that Margaret's story was not one of victimization, but of triumph. The revelation of Margaret's survival and the full story of her escape fundamentally changed how our community remembered the events of 1904, transforming what had been a tale of tragedy and loss into something far more powerful and inspiring. When Catherine agreed to let me share Margaret's story with the Juneau Historical Society, it became a symbol of hope for other communities dealing with hidden violence and predatory behavior, proof that even the most isolated and vulnerable people could find ways to protect themselves and seek justice when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The story also prompted a re-examination of other unsolved disappearances in Alaska's history, leading to the identification of several additional cases that bore the hallmarks of Thomas's methods, and ultimately helping to bring closure to families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their missing loved ones. But perhaps, most importantly, Margaret's story inspired the creation of support networks and safety programs that helped protect travelers and immigrants from the kind of exploitation that Thomas had practiced, ensuring that her courage and resourcefulness would continue to save lives long after her own story had ended. As I sit here now, in the final years of my own life, I am reminded every day of the lesson that Margaret Holloway taught me through her extraordinary survival, that the human spirit is stronger than the coldest winter, more enduring than the hardest stone, and more powerful than the cruelest evil that walks among us. The truths that were thawed from the past in those photographs and letters didn't just solve a mystery that had haunted Juneau for decades. They revealed that sometimes, when the world seems darkest and hope seems lost, ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things simply by refusing to surrender to despair, and that legacy of courage can warm hearts and inspire action for generations to come, long after the snow has melted and the ice has cleared.